While I normally cover the Game of Thrones franchise on my channel, I want to take a serious moment here with an audio-only podcast to direct all of my viewers that you really need to watch the new documentary that came out a month ago, Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV. Apart from that, it's just a really good documentary in general and covering serious issues of child abuse and just workplace abuse among the writing staff. There were eerie parallels between the toxic boss stuff that Nickelodeon's Dan Schneider was doing and what David Benioff was doing on Game of Thrones. And that really isn't a surprise or a revelation. It's just I was nodding that this is following the template, and this isn't even the first time we've heard similar stories from other shows. Last year, veteran reporter Maureen Ryan, veteran of 20 years of reporting on stuff, put out this really great book, Burn It Down, on how the TV industry got really corrupt in the past 20 years, and this is in part what led to the recent months-long writers' strike. That it wasn't about AI, its conditions were so bad, they cut corners everywhere, not just in pay, but we don't need to pay to train people, we don't need to pay to have multiple writers so there's oversight, so they sort of convinced themselves we can have one super showrunner in charge of everything, they're perfect, they're on a pedestal, they have no oversight, and this was just a recipe for abuse. And you see this playing out again and again. I already made a video about the sample chapter she put out on what was notably considered one of the worst writers' rooms of the 2000s, the writers' room for Lost. And again, we saw just the parallels of that. When we say toxic boss, I mean these petty tyrants who very specifically exert their dominance by being locker room frat boy humor, that they are as crass and gross as possible in their insults to try, and it's childish, but it's them trying to one-up each other to show, I can dominate you by making really crass sex jokes, and it's the same pattern. Not just of being strict, but of the pettiness. And eventually it stops even being efficient, it just turns into a personality cult, and spirals out of control, because you put one guy in charge with no oversight. So it's just watching the Quiet on Set thing, I just kept nodding. It's not even Benioff specifically. I wasn't nodding, this is what Benioff did, so much as I was nodding, this is exactly the type of thing Maureen Ryan was talking about in her book, even though she didn't cover Nickelodeon in her thing. And on a wider level, the campaign that led to this documentary, that I didn't know that there was a YouTube campaign for years, just grassroots campaign of fan documentaries trying to expose these are things he really did. And eventually one or two cast members started coming forward, one wrote a really scathing autobiography, and it came to a head that 2018 Dan Schneider was gone. So why did they make this documentary? That's another big question of why did you make this? Well, there's systemic problems in the industry that are still valid. And on top of that, we don't want Dan Schneider to be able to enjoy his legacy. That he doesn't deserve a legacy of success, that this was a travesty that you were allowed to do this for this long. Some people are, why do you want to care? It already happened. It's usually we're only able to report on these things long after they've happened. And it is a template for when is it Benioff's turn, and it filled me with hope of just, this started out as a YouTube campaign, and as one man, after my first few years on this, I realized as one man I can't do this. It's not going to be me triumphantly doing this, it's the YouTube channels report on this stuff for the fans. And not me, but someone else, eventually mainstream reporters, mainstream journalists will eventually pick up on it. Maybe not even from my videos, maybe things I point out that trickle up to other more professional YouTube channels will eventually just bubble up to journalists who will then feel like reporting on it, and eventually it'll turn into something. So I hope I lay the foundations for other people with what I'm doing, with like what other critical channels like Glidus, Red Team Review, Preston Jacobs, the channels that are really critical of what Benioff did both privately and publicly, I hope that eventually bubbles up to reporters that you see the model of how it happened with this. So the task that falls to me is I'm doing all of the original research just to put it out there. As the saying goes, to fling a light into the future, just in the hope that someday some real journalist will pick up on it as evidence to run with, that others will be able to use it, but I'm just supplying it, that it won't be me. I'm just doing the research for the fandom itself. Something more than that will have to be done by journalistic outlets with real resources. I don't know. We are very early in all of this. But it filled me with hope that the people who started the YouTube campaigns against Dan Snyder in the late 2010s, that this was the culmination of all of that eventually did come. If it didn't seem like it would achieve anything at first, eventually you have to have hope for that. Now, two big disclaimers before I continue. First, I was not personally familiar with all this source material of the Dan Schneider era, because I had aged out of it by then. I was 14 in the year 2000, which is when he started, roughly when the Dan Schneider era began, when he started being a showrunner, this executive helming multiple shows at Nickelodeon. He was a writer on all that leading up to this, but the point where it was really the Dan Schneider is the star of the network, the star producer making all these shows, that was 2000. That, you know how we say, like, as a true child of the 90s, these are the classic Nicktoons you liked, like Rocko's Modern Life, Clarissa Explains It All, the classic original seasons of all of that when Kenan Thompson was there. But they explain that, well, a kids' network is specifically tied to age cohorts. The cast ages out of things with live-action shows. So, like, since this documentary came out, Kenan Thompson and Melissa Joan Hart have been interviewed and politely, logically explained, I believe these cast members who have been making these criticisms, but, like, if it was something in 2005, I was there 10 years before, it wasn't like that. But I acknowledge, like, Dan Schneider wasn't the guy in charge when I was doing my show. And it's disturbing that after I left the network, these things were happening under the new regime. That I'm part of that older generation. But same thing here, that as a child in the 90s, this wasn't really affecting me. I didn't grow up with iCarly or Victorious or other shows like that. But it turns out this was an entire campaign behind the scenes, so I'm not as familiar with it, and I haven't been following it as closely, and others know more than me. The second point of this is I have been trying to catch up on these documentaries covering this in the past few weeks. I like the disclaimers some of those have put up front saying, we're sticking to what's in the actual documentary, because there's the usual stuff that comes out after any really controversial documentary. Some cast members saying it went too far, more alleging it didn't go far enough, to things that they suspect happened. But the disclaimer these other YouTube documentaries put out, which is, I'm sticking to the stuff that we can confirm happened. For legal reasons, or just for the sake of truth, let's just stick to the stuff that things Schneider brazenly did in public and that no one reported on as inappropriate at the time are the ones that infuriate me most, Or that Benioff did on camera in an interview, which was very insulting and people just passed off as normal. There might have been other stuff going on that we don't know about, or that people suspect, or try to read into. I know you can go down the rabbit hole, but also for time, I don't want this to be 2 hours long. I'm sticking to what's in the aired documentary. And I admit the documentary is a starting point. And the point of this video is just I urge people to watch that. And if you want to go on to other more in-depth analysis that the YouTube community has been making, you're free to do that. I'm sticking to the point of this is just watch this documentary and focus on the stuff, even the stuff we can confirm happened, was shocking and upsetting. So I hope I have your forgiveness on that I am an outsider on this. I really cannot talk about it with authority because I'm unfamiliar with it. I know there are other accusations going around, but let's stick to what we can confirm on all of this. That first off, I have 8 points here. First is During Dan Schneider's tenure as this showrunner on multiple Nickelodeon projects from around 2000 to 2018, he was this petty tyrant. He was very crass, and it's that locker room thing of I'm trying to be as gross as possible as a domination tactic, but at the same time he was put on a pedestal. That just, this is exactly what Benioff was doing, this is what Lost was doing in Maureen Ryan's book, all of that. And the problem that there was no oversight, and on top of that, it isn't just, oh, he's mean, but Dan Schneider was breaking actual rules. I mean, objective rules. Like, there's a point where there were two female writers, Christy Stratton and Jenny Kilgan, who he hired at half pay. That he was paying these two women the price of one writer, when it turns out that they were unaware there was a union rule that prevents you from doing that. There is a minimum pay according to writers' guilds that you can pay someone. And he was furious when they pointed it out to the studio. And it's, dude, you were the one breaking the rule. This was petty, and little things like that. And there's other things like with the child actors pervasively breaking child labor laws. And not just that you need to be constantly chaperoned by your parents so, like, you're not alone with a stranger adult lead to sexual abuse. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about with the parents in the room, they would urge the kids, work more than, there's a maximum limit to the number of hours a child actor can work. They'd break that all the time because they were running overtime, and it was just, come on, kid, don't you want to be part of the program here? And tell the parents that too. So they were there. They all knew they were breaking the rules all the time. That when there's no oversight, it's not just, oh, I told them not to. Oversight includes enforcement. And after that controversy with the Alec Baldwin Rust shooting that's been in the news again because of the trial, you need to have people like enforcing stunt safety laws and things. And well, the laws on we were reading, there's a lot of stunt safety problems that Game of Thrones had, we only recently found out about. Oh, we had those rules, we just ignored them. That you need oversight. So a lot of this is just that he was petty, crass, he'd ignore rules, and no one would bother enforcing them. Little things, I'm talking about this at the beginning, that just trying to gross people out as much as possible. And this is just the bullying in the writer's room is what I'm talking about. Not even the stuff that some of the child actors said he was entirely nice to them, others that he gave them a cold shoulder, but the crass domineering of the frat boy locker room talk in the writer's room. This is a consistent thing. This is what Maureen Ryan talked about. All of that, when you see that, like, Benioff has a really crass sense of humor. But distinct enough from that I'm splitting it off as my second point. The pervasive pranking, which is also part of that frat boy culture, that Maureen Ryan has again said is endemic across the whole thing. In the documentary, they talk about how Dan Schneider would constantly prank people, and not only get away with it, but they'd have to laugh along and go, isn't it funny what Dan did? And increasingly, he did it on TV, on video. And they play it off as a joke. That what really struck me is there's this thing in the documentary where they said, it's weird looking back on it, like 10 years later, there were these videos that they would put out in online platforms publicly that were supposed to be behind-the-scenes videos that were of Dan just messing with people, like holding the camera too close to their face, interrupting them. What really struck me is this scene where there's one of the child stars of a show, and he just, with the camera, sneaks up behind her and shouts, "Ooga booga," really loud to startle her she jumps to her feet, then turns around, and you can see in her eyes how upset she is, but she has to make a fake smile and go, "Oh, Dan, you're just being Dan." That when you rewatch these videos, you can see, and don't take my word for it, they point out in the documentary, just how uncomfortable everyone looks, even though verbally they're going along with it, because he's their boss. That this is before the Me Too stuff, which really started in 2017. I think that's part of the reason why Dan Schneider was forced out by 2018, that it was a lot more scrutiny then. That you should never be the boss casually pranking people. Oh, it's a joke. No, it is exerting your power over them. This isn't, oh, well, we're joking back and forth. And it's the fact that he managed to do this publicly, and they remark in this documentary, how did no one talk about this? These were public videos. Similarly, how David Benioff would constantly prank the cast of Game of Thrones with fake scripts, and at the time they managed to put a positive spin on it. It's not just that he pranked them, but this was very public, and they just put that spin on it, and the media ignored it. Of, oh, I'm giving them fake scripts. No, they said, by season 8, we couldn't even tell it was a real script anymore. Half of us seriously thought these were fake scripts. And they only fed us a half-truth, that they said, oh, we gave Kit Harington a prank script that he was horribly burned and would need a lot of scar prosthetics and he would be bald for the rest of the show. We later found out that he actually came in to complain, and they said, and they later said, oh, yeah, he came in and we told him it was fake. They sat down with him for a solid hour. Actually, imagine if you're sitting with your boss for a full 60 minutes, 1 minute at a time, where they're saying, look, we gotta do this. It's what the studio wants. It's gotta be real, authentic. And only after you really broke him did they admit, oh, we were just pranking you. The gaslighting of that this wasn't, I gave you a fake script, which you should never do in the first place. Think about that. Just how some of these things, they would wait until as the cast picked up that they were willing to give us fake scripts. They do it longer and longer. I know for Alfie Allen, it took weeks for him to realize it was a fake script that they gave him. And they wouldn't come out and announce it. They'd wait for someone to complain because they wanted that rush of breaking them before going, gotcha, which is wasting time. Time is a finite resource. So it just really upset me at the time that when I eventually realized that I was laughing along with this in the early seasons when they were passing it off as a joke of, oh, it's fun that he pranks them. After the Me Too thing, just the toxic boss part of Me Too, you should never be pranking your subordinates, your cast members, your employees. It's not as if this is anything unique to Schneider or Benioff. Maureen Ryan said that this is a widespread tactic of toxic bosses dominating people in at least the writing industry for television. But if you are watching this as someone who is familiar with this Game of Thrones stuff and realize this is Benioff acting inappropriately, it's just, that was one of the major moments of eerie recognition where I saw the same patterns happening in this playing out. And not just the pranking, but the fact that it was pretty public and they just put a positive spin on it, and everyone acted along with it, including the media. So I'm interested if you haven't seen this yet, or if you have seen it and are familiar with what I'm talking about, just no one talks about it. And this brings me, of course, to point 3 out of 8 here. I call it the laugh track of the camera. That when they put things out in promo videos, it puts a positive spin on it. That, like, just how much on Game of Thrones they had those inside the episodes, which these aren't candid behind-the-scenes videos. These are promo videos that are heavily scripted and heavily edited to present them in a positive light. Then how jarring it was when they had that third-party documentary team for the Last Watch documentary who didn't get the memo that you're not supposed to be candid. And, like, when they show, like, the script read and everyone looks really upset, like, they would have never allowed that on the inside the episodes. That the laugh track of the camera, not just that, like, in interviews they put a spin on, oh, we prank people. That the laugh track of the camera when Dan Schneider is running up behind a girl and shouting just to startle her, and when they put it online, it seems normal because, well, someone edited it, put a laugh track in, other things Dan did, but segues into things that were in the actual TV episodes, which at the time people laughed off, but in retrospect, this was either insulting or dumb. Like how on Game of Thrones in the later seasons, that people were praising, oh, this is amazing, when it's just like dick jokes and stuff. Or really crass sex humor, that this is tonally different from what you did before. But it's harder to see in a drama. I call it the drama equivalent of a laugh track, is like the music is swelling, or it's framed as if that character just said something clever when it actually was a really stupid line. With Dan Schneider, I'm unfamiliar with these shows. I hadn't really watched iCarly and stuff. It was after my time. they had these increasingly crass sex jokes in the episodes because Snyder has a dirty sense of humor at best. And that's the at best explanation for this. And they'll play laugh tracks as if something funny just happened when that was an inappropriate joke. And it's like that alternate universe of the sitcom where they'll say something really, it is not funny, it's an age-inappropriate joke, and they'll have the cast members just talking in a funny voice, smile with a fake smile, haha, that was fun, and the laugh track plays, and thinking, and I've checked back a little, 90s Nickelodeon shows had, like, setup and punchlines. This is just odd jokes that it's almost like a dream you're watching, and then they're reacting as if it's funny. Well, specifically, it wasn't even the weird sex joke stuff, I'll get to that in a minute. I didn't know that Dan Schneider made a kid version of Fear Factor, where they'd have them do gross or upsetting things like get covered in peanut butter and licked by dogs. And they have the child actor grown up now on the documentary saying, I didn't want to do that. That is one of the standout moments of the documentary for me. The point where it's like, I think it was handle scorpions, where they had a child handling scorpions on a Fear Factor for kids. And when this is what I really mean by the laugh track of the camera, it's a live audience, so the audience is laughing because they're like, well, if it wasn't safe, they wouldn't do it. The audience is laughing, or they play a laugh track, or the camera is focused on them, presenting it through editing as, look how fun this is, how exciting this is, and there's an announcer hyping up, oh, how crazy is they have a scorpion here, and then they zoom out to the documentary space in the documentary with the 15 years later adult grown-up actor without music playing, without laugh tracks going, how is this a joke? This isn't funny. I did not want to be handling scorpions. This was deeply upsetting. It was scary or humiliating. Or other stuff they did with the slime and stuff, or with have a nozzle full of coffee beans and sugar or something, where it's like, this isn't a joke. Arguably, the scorpion stuff is what really got me, is this is scary, or the licked by dogs and peanut butter inappropriate. It's the contrast between the fake reality we are sold with the camera, within the camera frame and the editing, and all the fake smiles for Dan Schneider, versus years later, the real people in the nonfiction setting of the documentary studio stating, I didn't want to do this, I was humiliated by this, much less I was not enthusiastic about this at the time. And how is this even funny? I didn't think it was funny. This isn't funny for a kid's show. That, well, everyone's cheering, which I guess leads into point 4 out of 8 in this, which is a big point. At the very least, Dan Schneider has a very dirty sense of humor, which is inappropriate for children's shows. That these are dirty jokes, that some of them are sex jokes or feet jokes, which would go over the kids' heads. And that's why I put so many disclaimers at the beginning about not reading into this too much, just what the documentary says. They don't read into it that much. Because there are people online going over it, and I am not an expert on this. I'll just say that some people accuse that Dan Schneider was getting sexual gratification out of putting dirty jokes into these television shows. But it wasn't private. They're saying the public things he did, we can look at these, parse out, this is blatantly a sex joke. And it is, but all that really proves conclusively is that he has a dirty sense of humor. I hope you understand my point here, and I say this with humility. How would we ever conclusively prove that he was doing this as some sort of, I'm getting some sort of weird sexual satisfaction of doing this brazenly in public is gratifying? How would we make such a subtle distinction? I mean, in terms of legally, in terms of proving as a crime, if evidence comes up of him ranting about that in some recording, that'd be pretty big, but how would you prove that? And I don't mean that as a defense, because even taking as a given that he just has a really dirty frat boy sense of humor, that is awful that he was doing this on children's shows. This is like late night comedy dirty stuff. How did he rise to prominence as a children's television writer? For the preteen crowd, from like the 10 to 12 crowd, you should not be putting in those kinds of jokes. And if that's what he's good at, why are you running children's programming? So just others will talk about that more than me. I've not as of yet seen any direct, like a recording of him ranting, oh, I'm so into this. How would you prove that? I mean, I don't think you can prove that just from watching the episodes cold. You'd have to have some sort of behind-the-scenes evidence of that. So people just parsing we've proven that, yes, these are dirty, age-inappropriate jokes. So sticking with that is something we conclusively know, that he just has a really dirty sense of humor, and that's backed up by people saying, oh, he, would make crass jokes in the writer's room and stuff. That's just that type of person he is, that frat boy personality. These are inappropriate, and I love that, again, the contrast between as presented and the reality. That the documentary, just when you're watching it in like iCarly or something, it's everyone's smiling, the camera's focused on, ha ha, I just told a joke, and there's a laugh track, when that isn't funny. It's simply not a joke, or it's inappropriate, or it's like it's a joke, but it's something you'd see on HBO, not a children's show. And you cut back to the studio with no laugh track, with just no quick edits, just the panelists going, the guest who used to be child actors going, how is that a joke? Long pause for emphasis. What exactly is the joke here? Please verbalize what the children are supposed to think is funny in this. Are these jokes for the adults? The adults would be, the parents would be horrified if they had these things like sex jokes, or oral sex things of a girl getting shot with goo in the face from a tube of toothpaste or things like that. Another accusation, which again, this is so subtle, how would we prove this, is that Schneider might have a foot fetish sexually, but that is so subtle it's hard to tell. I mean, they do have a lot of jokes involving feet. Are they necessarily sexualized? How would you conclusively prove that? There's one particular scene that stood out in the documentary of all the kids go to a spa where they do that thing where you have fish eat the dead flaky skin off your feet so they're very smooth. That's a real thing they do in spas. And then they just randomly have characters rubbing their feet and going, wow, look how smooth this person's feet are. And then a laugh track plays and it's like, what was the joke? And again, it's like this is, Nickelodeon, where they have, people getting slimed, or a giant foot crushing things, and, armpit humor, smelly foot humor. Like, maybe that's just the wacky sense of humor they had. I don't know if that was sexualized or not, but the stuff that was blatantly, the point where the people who were on set do say, the men, Schneider and the men around him said, oh, it looks like she got a face shot full of goo, and started giggling like frat boys, that they knew that stuff, at least they knew, was a sexualized joke. And there were other things, which the documentary has a lot more of, that it's pretty blatant throughout the whole thing, that he has a dirty sense of humor, and taking that, that's the most we can conclusively say. How is this children's programming? Even if it isn't a sign of wider abuse. That even if it isn't immoral, which it is, or if it's not necessarily even illegal, it's inappropriate and immoral, and even ignoring that, it's incompetent. I mean, we hired you to make jokes for children, and you made adult jokes which went over their heads. Even the cast member said, this went over my head at the time, that you were hired for quality children's jokes, and you gave us a bunch of dick jokes. Purely in terms of, because this is the only thing the industry understands, is money. In terms of money spent and product delivered, you didn't give us children's writing. You gave us something we couldn't, that was actually, at best, neutral, at best a hindrance. Which leads to point 5. What did Dan Schneider actually contribute? That this is one of those two big quotes from the 5th and final episode, the retrospective episode, where it was one of the cast members looking back on it, Brian Hearn, is this one really scathing sentence. I wish they'd have a follow-up episode specifically devoted to just exactly how much did Dan Schneider even contribute to the success of things like The Amanda Bynes Show and iCarly in terms of the writing. This is, quote, Brian Hearn. Realistically, if you take the inappropriate jokes away, do you have a show anymore? If you take all the foot jokes and the face shots and all that inappropriateness out, is it just commercials then? That what exactly was Dan Schneider's contribution? That the picture they imply, without having an episode devoted to it, is that he was hogging all the credit from his subordinate writers, and they never challenged him because he bullied them into submission, which makes a warped sense that he needed to be a bully to browbeat everyone else from realizing he wasn't really a genius. That, like, Christy Stratton and Jenny Kilgan seemed like they were a lot more responsible for specific story and writing decisions. Or like the star of iCarly or something, you like the actors' performances, or Amanda Bynes herself, more than the actual joke content he was contributing. And I'd like to see a follow-up where those writers really delve into how much of the writing was really him and how much was him as a figurehead, claiming, well, I organize everyone. How much did he really contribute? That's point 5 here. Only briefly brought up by Hearn in the very end, of if you took out all of these inappropriate jokes, what else did Schneider actually contribute? Now, there was a show, otherwise like iCarly, Victorious wouldn't have been hits. The story parts of those shows that people were watching were written by people like Stratton and Kilgan. Obviously, there's multiple shows with different sets of writers, but they just hog credit like that. Again, there's that whole thing where, for Game of Thrones, after season 8 Backlash, though it was really season 5 onwards, Brian Cogman, who was part of the trio with Benioff and Weiss, he's their yes man. He's still on Twitter but rarely talks about it, and I've screenshotted this, I'll make videos about it later, but it really stuck with me that because people were trying to compartmentalize, well, I don't like the writing, but I like the acting and special effects and music. In a warped way, I agree with Cogman that he went on Twitter and said, I'm tired of seeing so many people saying that, because you can't compartmentalize those. They're all together. I agree with that, yeah, you can't just say it was good if the writing was bad. But Cogman went on to say, he actually, then Benioff Weiss himself has said similar things, he tried to take credit for all the other department heads. He said, Cogman actually said this, oh, you like the music but didn't like the writing? Well, we hired the music composer Amin Javadi, which means you should be praising us for the music because we had the sense to hire him. Okay, if ever you have a boss talking like that, run. Because that is that mentality. Like, look at other things like Denis Villeneuve with Hans Zimmer or something. That he praises, all the praise from the music goes to him. That he is a genius at this, not praise me for hiring him. You can tell you're in a toxic boss situation where you are admitting that you like hogging credit from other people. Having the sense to hire them isn't enough. That's not your job. Your job, well, I'm delegating. No, the writing was the specific thing that was your job. So it ties into that whole issue of, was this guy just a figurehead that not only is there, well, I'm a toxic boss, but I'm a genius who's difficult to work with. No, you're just a fraud. And the abuse isn't a side effect of that. It's you bullying people into realizing that you're not really good at this. Which sort of leads into point 6 from Maureen Ryan's Burn It Down, which was one of her main conclusions. Successful producers are above criticism in Hollywood. That as long as you are perceived of as a success, the studio will not listen to complaints about you. That everyone, well, Stanley Kubrick and Akira Kurosawa were tough to work with, but they were geniuses. That is a little more muddled, but even then, you aren't Kubrick, you aren't Kurosawa. You are David Benioff, you are Dan Schneider, and our specific complaint is you aren't actually perfect. that you are an incompetent writer. So it's not just that they did something offensive, but this is bad writing. And you were hired to do a children's show, or you don't write women well, or all of that. And it's that circular logic of, how dare you complain that this celebrity showrunner isn't perfect? They are perfect, which means they're above criticism. Like, this is specifically what we're saying, that they were figureheads. It's the perception of, they're basically a brand name. And the studio doesn't want to lose the brand name, even if they realize Benioff isn't actually worth the $200 million we paid for him at Netflix, or Dan Schneider, a Nick show by Dan Schneider isn't actually worth anything anymore. The brand name is, even if he's reduced to figurehead status. And it takes a while to sour a brand name writer where they're no longer a boost to the name recognition, but a liability. But it eventually comes. And we've seen this with Snyder, we've seen it with Joss Whedon. The moment you are weak, everyone will abandon you. Because when you rule through fear, the moment you're weak, people abandon you. And this is a core point of the A Song of Ice and Fire novels that Benioff and Weiss never really put in, that the northern vassals are loyal to the death to the Starks even when they're losing. But the Lannisters' allies abandon them as soon as they can, and the Bolton allies abandon them as soon as they start losing, because you ruled through fear. So that's when all of this will start snowballing. It's on top of that, Snyder had a string of not successes, that increasing complaints even from brave cast members coming forward. Other documentaries can go into more detail, and specifically what brought him down back in 2018 before the documentary, but it was just, everything eventually caught up. That you can't keep running like that forever, and there's only so long you can go faking it. But just the perception of they are above criticism. The media are, and the other big part is not just the studios, it's the media. The media are too cowardly to really come forward and complain about someone until they're already losing. But at least when that happens, we get to, they stole the show, and now they stole all of this, and now they're trying to steal history. That just as Benioff is he ruined Game of Thrones and is still trying to put a spin on, oh, it was Martin's fault for not having the books ready. I'm this brilliant writer. You were a figurehead from day one. Or Schneider going, I'm this genius showrunner, when iCarly succeeded in spite of you, not because of you. They are trying to steal the legacy of their projects and maintain their reputation. And what we can at least do now is win the history books. That no, you do not deserve a legacy of this, a positive legacy forever, or a good reputation. This is the absence of legacy. This is negative. And the other half of it is, this is a warning to future history, future generations, of how corrupt the system was. This is something that should never be allowed to happen again, because it could easily happen to any other major project. So when people, oh, why do you care it's still happening? There were no changes. The system is as corrupt as it ever was. We're starting to see some changes because of the writers' strikes, but other things that are still systemic problems. And on a more personal level, you got away with it without accountability. That yes, accountability is still a thing, there is still the court of public opinion, and there are still large numbers of people saying, oh, well, it could have been that bad. Yes, it was. Two related points I'm going to round this out with, though. Points 7 and 8 out of 8. Again, I don't want to get onto this too much, because a lot of it wasn't specifically stuff Dan Schneider is being specifically accused of. But, like I said, systemic problems in the industry with the child sex abuse stuff they talk about specifically in the documentary. And if there's other accusations out there, that's separate from this. I'm going by what's in the documentary. That this didn't involve him specifically. There were multiple sex abuse things at Nickelodeon, much of which was due to negligence. That you can blame the studio for negligence. And indirectly Snyder, I guess. That on top of that, we break child labor laws by, with their parents, having them work more hours than they were legally allowed to. They just have the child actors wandering around set unchaperoned a lot of the time, or just going to private events, that you're not supposed to do that. And ultimately, this led to multiple and unrelated sex abuse things. I mean, this deeply hardcore sex offender who was, after all, who was really into, like, wrote journals about the underage girls he was into and stuff. That was one guy they caught. There was more than one in this. And they would then catch them. And I think the most you can blame the studio and Snyder for is you should be strictly enforcing those rules. But it was bigger than Snyder himself. It was the studio, and Disney had the same problems. The thing I keep thinking of is the really great Chernobyl documentary, not documentary, Chernobyl miniseries. It felt like a documentary, which happened to air on HBO right after Game of Thrones season 8. Which, it makes sense. It was a co-production with Sky. The old HBO never would have made something that was so critical of a flawed system that believed it was perfect. That the point of the Chernobyl miniseries is it wasn't ultimately the corrupt plant manager's fault. This is a corrupt system that allowed a man like that to thrive. And on top of that, the actual design flaw that was the last straw that made the reactor explode was something he didn't even know about, which the government did, but they let go anyway because it was cheaper. They said, oh, what are the odds there's ever going to be a near reactor break? We wouldn't need the emergency shutoff. Why worry about something that isn't going to happen? That the whole thing, the belief that we can do no wrong, is a recipe for disaster in a flawed system like that. So the one that really stands out, though, is the stuff with Drake Bell. Because he's a headliner actor on this. He's a very prominent actor, not just a cast member. He was starring his own show, and this he was raped. He was sexually abused by one of the dialogue coaches, Brian Peck, and the point, it was horrible. He talks about it. He has problems with that, and the issue is that many other people who work, because Peck groomed people. He was always friendly to everyone. So he's the type of person who makes it a point to be friends with a lot of other actors. So a lot of other prominent people at Nickelodeon and elsewhere sided with him when Drake broke his silence and actually brought him to court for this. And Drake insists in the documentary, Dan Schneider was 100% supportive of me since the moment I told him about this. Since the moment I broke my silence, he called me on the phone and said, Drake, is this true? And he said, yes. And he just paused and went, you have my full support if there's anything I can do for you. And throughout his trial, Drake still maintains Snyder supported me when he didn't need to, when a lot of other prominent actors were actually vehemently against me for this guy. He didn't need to support me. Now, maybe this was for show, maybe it wasn't, I don't know. He could have easily not done it. And regardless of what ultimately comes out, I honestly think you can be a toxic boss and still have the basic human decency of not being a child molester or supporting a child molester. That doesn't erase the toxic boss stuff, like the stuff he did with the writer pay, with the female writers, bossing them around, bullying them. You can be like that and still have the basic human decency that he supported Drake when no one else would. That kind of, and maybe there's some other aspect of that I don't know about, but okay, that I don't, from the way the documentary presented it, it didn't seem like Snyder. There were points when you could argue this was your neglect, but by that extension, it was the neglect of the entire studio system. So, and again, the point of the documentary is, if you blame, oh, it was all Schneider's fault, like, then Disney hired Brian Peck for The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, and didn't bother doing a basic background check that by that point he was a registered sex offender, like on the registry. They just didn't check. And you are a show that you're a channel that prominently works with child actors. So this wasn't even a Nickelodeon thing, this was Disney. They fired him as soon as they found out. But your ignorance of this, you are major children's television producers, and you're not following basic guidelines on labor laws, on chaperones, on background checks on all of your staff. So that's more of a systemic problem than something I think you could really pin on him. And I'm leaving it as the bullying and toxic boss. The pranking on camera is something that objectively happened because it was on camera, which I find deeply upsetting. And taking credit for the other writers when cast and crew pointing out, like, other than his dirty jokes, like, he didn't really contribute that much. So I'll leave it at that. But point 8, okay, this ties into, I said there were two big quotes from the final episode that really stuck with me. The first one was Hearn saying, what exactly did he contribute? Because he kept passing himself off as I'm this brilliant guy, put up with my eccentricities when he isn't. That's one part which I wish they'd make another episode about. Another thing I wish they'd make another episode about is point 8 here, the lack of media attention. This is like in the 2000s. This is a long time ago. Even this isn't even like the current media. This is people who were doing it then. I can't verbalize the impact of Drake saying this to the camera. Like, spontaneously. He didn't plan it out as a speech. He's fumbling for words himself. He has this lost look on his face of bafflement and confusion. And in this one moment of clarity, he's just stunned. And Drake saying, why didn't the media report on this at the time? Even to put a negative spin on me. Because at the time, that he was anonymous at the time, that they didn't come forward publicly, but the news reporters could have found out there is an unnamed child actor within the Nickelodeon studio system who accused someone of molesting him, and he won the case. That guy was convicted. He went to jail for only a year and a half, was a registered sex offender. He said even after Brian Peck was convicted, why didn't they report on this? Or during the trial, why didn't they even, side with the people criticizing me? I felt abandoned by all these prominent actors that came forward to defend Brian Peck. And the news didn't report on it one way or the other. They just didn't cover it. So it's one sentence. It's such enticement for, we need another episode of why was there no coverage of any of this, even the public convictions. The Dan Schneider bullying people behind the scenes stuff I get. Could the studio have instituted a cover-up even after Peck was convicted? Possibly. But on the other hand, Snyder said he'd give him any support he could. I've seen some arguing that, well, maybe he did cover it up out of a sense of his anonymity. You could have kept his anonymity and still reported on Brian Peck. Maybe Disney wouldn't have hired him then and then canceled him quickly from Sweet Life of Zack and Cody. I don't know. Okay, I don't know any of this. I'm sorry. If others have speculated on this better than I ever could. I honestly didn't get the the problem we have is access journalism, that the media won't report on anything controversial until it's already happened. I like that phrase, it's like a bank that'll only give you a loan when you're not in debt. That the media will only the major journalism rarely is the turning point on someone until after it's already happened. That they only turned on Dan Schneider, this whole documentary, 6 years after he was eventually pressured out at Nickelodeon. The Brian Peck thing, that just Drake Bell saying, why didn't they cover this, even to side with him against me? They just didn't cover it. His bafflement at that you could have found out about this is a controversy and just we don't talk about. I understand you want to work with Nickelodeon. What about like reporters who are allied with Disney, who did, this is our business rival. Why are we taking, this is something Maureen Ryan talks about in her book, even though that wasn't sexual abuse, that was just abuse in general. There is a culture of silence. We've seen this with bigger reporters than me talking about the Me Too movement. There is a culture of silence out of fear that you don't break ranks. When, like, even at the time, like, Nick probably wouldn't have dropped reporters for something like this. Probably. I mean, just as Snyder said Drake insists he really supported him. So if anyone's talking in the comments, I'm unfamiliar with all this. All I did was watch this documentary. I'm starting to watch a few other videos. Those are the two things that it left me with, those two quotes. Him going, why isn't the media covering any of this? my sex abuse or the other stuff as that transition period. I wish they'd cover this more, where the first actress came out, wrote an autobiography saying, the autobiography is titled "I'm Glad My Mother Died," because she was one of those helicopter moms pressuring her into show business. Came out and there's controversy, and originally the media was against her until they realized a lot of it was true. I wish they'd dissect the secondary level, meta level, the media's mishandling of this on a couple of years before journalists finally came around to taking it seriously. Specifically with Snyder, and also quite separately from that, the Drake Bell stuff, but that and Hearn's quote about, if you take away all of the inappropriate jokes and bullying, what exactly was Dan Schneider's contribution to all of this? He was a figurehead, and they defended him because he was a fake genius above criticism. That not only, this would be upsetting even if he was a talented expert, and on top of that, he wasn't. It's like one of those stupid parody movies where, like, idiot pretends to be rich guy and everyone treats him like he walks on water, and he's not even rich. Just pretending to be it and faking his way through it. Similarly, Benioff really isn't a genius. He's had basically just Game of Thrones under his belt. Taking credit for someone else, we haven't really seen. They promised a bunch of projects for Netflix that he didn't really make. At what point do you realize this guy isn't the genius that the media presented him as and built him up as? So, I'm not good at this. I feel awful. Just please, I hope you're gentle in the comments. There's a whole fandom research movement devoted to the criticisms at Nickelodeon, which I am ignorant of and just starting to read through. I'm not going to keep following this. Purpose of this podcast was just to tell you guys, as a starting point, you really need to watch this documentary on its own sake, and because purely the workplace toxic boss stuff in the writer's room that he did, the videos of pranking people, and then them with, you can see in their eyes, they're not enjoying this. Ha ha, that's him pranking us. And the studio, them going, how the hell were these promotional videos released publicly and no one remarked on how inappropriate his behavior was? That I see the parallels between that and Benioff's stuff, particularly with the pranking, that they actually managed to somehow put a positive spin on as one of the happy anecdotes about him, and not, post Me Too, that was deeply inappropriate, and even at the time was this mean-spirited way for you to assert your dominance over the cast and crew. It's never just funny joking around. This is always a power dynamic. So I'm left with those questions of when will the media finally get its turn for Benioff, I don't know. But ultimately this thing filled me with hope. That these people were making YouTube documentaries. They briefly talk about in the documentary that it bubbled up from YouTube documentaries throughout the late 20-teens until eventually journalists started taking it seriously. So Game of Thrones was a dead franchise for a couple of years. Now that House of the Dragon is back from break, back from the writer's strikes, we're going to be getting a successful show a year, so it's a franchise worth talking about. And as Benioff keeps falling short of expectations with like Three Body Problem or outright failures, nothing fails like failure. As time moves on, as he fails more, as the franchise goes on without him, there will be a point where we get our Ray Fisher moment, like with Joss Whedon, or with Dan Schneider, our I'm Glad My Mother Died book will eventually come out. And the phrase is, things happen slow until they happen fast. That when this happens, just like with Snyder, with Whedon, it will snowball. And everyone who's afraid of Benioff, realizing he is no longer in a position to retaliate against him, will come out of the woodwork with complaints, just as we saw things escalating with the Dan Schneider documentary. So, really looking forward to your comments on this. I'm terrified of them as well, because I know I mishandled this. I know I'm an amateur. I don't know that much about this, other than this documentary raised a lot of questions, and I saw scary parallels with what we saw with Joss Whedon, with Game of Thrones. Ultimately hope that, yes, our efforts researching this will not be in vain. It's just we're doing the research so that one day a new crop of journalists who aren't just Benioff fanboys like we had in 2017. A new crop of journalists, just due to turnover, will come out and go, you tarnished the reputation of... This was a top-level Emmy show. That these were the top Nicktoons or something, and no one was willing to take the criticism seriously for years. But the fans were determined and stuck through it. So, please, I hope you watch it, then comment in my comment section here, but please, it is well worth your time. Watch the first episode alone will suck you in. It is a very good documentary. It could obviously have done more, so could anything, but this is a good starting point for a bigger issue than you could ever fit in just 5 TV episodes. So, I'll try to respond to every comment in the description below. Please, I'm going to try to answer everything.